Today on Doomed, it is going down in Chile, ladies and gentlemen. On today's episode of Doomed with Matt Binder, analyst and former political campaign strategist Montserrat Nicolas joins the show to break down the ongoing protests in Chile. We're going to talk about how we got here, what this means for the future of neoliberalism. Me personally, I hope it means that the future is not looking bright for neoliberalism, and how what's happening in Chile might just spark similar protests right here in the U.S. and, hey, maybe even elsewhere around the world. And with that, well, before we get into the show, ladies and gentlemen, as always, you could go to patreon.com/MattBinder and support this show. Subscribe at youtube.com/MattBinder to the YouTube channel. If you're watching live on the live stream right now, you're already there. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce, let me pull us up here on the feed so you can actually see us, not just hear us. Montserrat Nicolas, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, I really appreciate you basically having to download the Skype app to do this.
Yeah, it was terrible. All these years, like, no way, Microsoft, no way.
Right. It's, unfortunately, though, Skype is the perfect tool to do this show. Other than that, though, I don't use Skype. So I definitely,
yeah, okay.
I feel you. Don't worry about it.
It's fine. It's okay.
Now, let's really jump into this, because this is, I think a lot of people are seeing the footage of these protests, and they're looking for information. And I mean, there are news outlets covering this, but before we went before we went live here on YouTube and elsewhere, I was mentioning to you how in the U.S. at least, even on social media here, what people are talking about in terms of the current protests going on, they talk about the protests in Hong Kong a lot. And I feel like the Chile protests, the videos are getting out there. Obviously, I've seen them. People have seen them. They're getting lots of views. But I just don't think there's a discourse surrounding what's going on in Chile like there is in Hong Kong here in the States. And before we went live, we were talking a little bit about why that may be. And I think, an obvious component to that is that, it's a lot easier for the media and political figures here in this country to support what's going on in Hong Kong because China is bad. That's the whole discourse around China here. Then, what's going on in Chile, which is basically, oh shit, the political system that we support here in the States and technically installed in Chile is under attack in these protests. So let's not really talk about it so much. That's what I think's going on, at least.
It could be. I think when it comes to the Hong Kong protests, obviously, I think you're right about the Chinese, stronghold, right, over what's almost like a colony, right?
Right.
Hong Kong is one of the most capitalistic places in the world, right? And so is Chile. And Chile is actually what you would say the most privatized country in the world. We have privatized, not we, but under our constitution from 1980, we have privatized absolutely everything. You name anything that you would think could not be privatized, we have that privatized, right? And it goes all the way back to this constitution, 1980, after the coup in 1973, right? We have a very bloody coup in Chile when they almost immediately start writing this new constitution, where basically the state becomes subsidiary to the market. So what that means, without being a constitutional lawyer, but it's very easy to read it and understand where the state is and what kind of power, what kind of role it should be playing in society, is that the state will only can't really compete with the private companies. And if it's going to compete in a certain marketplace, then it has to subsidize the private enterprises that operates in that marketplace. For example, education, health, which is the two big ones, right?
Wait, so all education in Chile is privatized? There's no like public school system?
No, we have a public school system, which is one of the reasons why the students are constantly protesting, right? Because it's being diminished, right?
Right. I mean, the same sort
We
of. I
also
mean,
have.
hey, welcome to the club.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. And they're I mean, I don't know how much you want to talk about the students really, but the students constantly, and they're very, very young, right? And they're constantly being in the forefront and the avant-garde of these protests, and they have not stopped for years now, right? You have a new wave coming up constantly, and they're more and more conscious about economics, macroeconomics. I mean, you hear them talk, and they're 13, 14 years old, and they know their shit, like they know exactly what's going on and how wrong the Constitution is and all the laws that comes out of that, right? So what we have in Chile, I think, some people have said that because we have this Constitution from 1980 that was basically installed by fire, by bombing the presidential palace, by making at least 3,400 people disappear, over 30,000 people raped, tortured, right? And hundreds of thousands of people exiled in a very small country, because back then we were only like 10 to 11 million people, right?
Right.
We do have a wealth. We have enormous copper resources and rare minerals and all that kind of stuff. So we are, in that sense, very powerful, but we are a small country when it comes to population, right? So the Constitution, they made a Constitution basically to rob the natural resources from the Chilean people. And they did that extremely well, right? And it's been going on. We have something called basically the democracy. Came back in 1989, 1990. But really, that was not a real democracy because the Constitution was still valid, so to speak, right? So I don't know, Matt. We could basically say that neoliberalism this is the crowd of neoliberalism and it's going to die there. I see it a little bit in the bigger terms. I do think that what they try to do in Chile has a longer history, and one of them is that the Chicago Boys, as we call them, which are basically this little model that the Chicago School, Milton Friedman and guys installed in Chile in the late 50s, right? Where they little by little start shipping students up to Chicago, and they will ship professors down there to the university, the Catholic University, right? And thinking ahead, thinking that these kids will eventually become big economists and eventually would be in charge of the economy, and will be able to implement all the monetary ideas that they had back then, right? And they actually did. They all became ministers of finance, minister of labor, heads of the central bank during the dictatorship, right? And in addition to all the privatization of the state-owned companies that Chile had, they also became extremely wealthy in their own right by buying all these companies for almost nothing, right? And the important part of this whole fight, actually, is the Social Security. So the Social Security was in 1980 privatized, completely privatized. I think it's the only country in the world that has that, right? So that model, right? So that model, supposedly after 30 years, people would have so much more money because this privatization of the Social Security would have worked so extremely well, right? And that is exactly now. And people are living on more or less $150 a month. That's after 30 years of working, right?
I joked before about the public education thing. Here in this country, they're trying to destroy Republicans, trying to destroy public education, privatize everything. And I joked about joining the club, Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for Chile, we're not in the privatization of Social Security club yet. Yet,
Yet.
Republicans have tried it, and they're gonna keep
And
trying
you
it,
know
I'm
what?
sure.
And
But
that guy, this is the crazy thing, because the guy that actually made this happen in Chile in 1980, his name is Jose Piñera. Jose Piñera is the brother of the current president, right? And Jose Piñera had made this little cottage industry out of the Kate Institute and the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., right? Where he basically travels all over the world telling everybody how wonderful this model that he came up with in Chile. The problem is that it's falling apart, right? Because the money is now going back to the people that, what's the name for it when people that get pension? Oh,
oh, right.
instead of
Pension.
instead
Right.
of that, it's basically being paid out and being kept by the funds that are managing all this money, an enormous amount of money. So it's very interesting, right? Today we have this president. He's a businessman. He's in his own right.
Oh, then we are
He's on
still
the
in the same
Forbes.
club.
Yes, we are. No, but that's the thing. Like, so United States, the Republicans and some Democrats have looked at Chile and they say like, hey, let's see how this model is working. This like hyper neoliberal model, right? Um, and it's clearly not working. So the fight that's going on in Chile, I would say, is actually the fight for the soul of capitalism and the fight of the soul of what we want to call neoliberalism, which is hardcore capitalism, right?
Right.
So it's the fight for that, right?
Right.
And it's so much bigger than our country,
Right.
why I can tell you this. So many people always said to me when I explained to them I'm from Chile and the situation in Chile, it's the most privatized country, blah blah, all that, right? And people say, even our neighbors, Argentines, Peruvian, Bolivians, you name it, right? And say, how come the Chilean people has not protested before? We have protested, right? But now it's getting to a point where like you can't take it anymore, right? The kids that are on the street today see their grandparents, their great grandparents living on $150. And now this is important fact. Santiago, that has around 6 million people, right? It's as expensive as New York.
Oh, wow.
Yes, exactly, right? So it's almost impossible. You can't live. You can't live. You have to constantly live on credit, right?
As someone who lives in New York, I can agree that you cannot live on. It's crazy.
No, there are
crazy.
square feet.
Yes.
I did the math, and the square feet of certain apartments in Santiago, they're more expensive than Upper East Side.
That's so we're talking more like San Francisco prices.
Yes, of course, Oakland. I don't know, but
except
it's
Facebook
expensive.
and all the other tech companies aren't the reason for it by buying up all the taking over all the land in San Francisco.
No.
That's not happening in Santiago.
No, I don't know. I think there was Google that decided to put in a big in Santiago now. So. But anyways, I mean, we have an enormous amount of money and the money is not trickling down. So what do you have? You have everybody on the street, right? And what is interesting here is also that the protests are not only young kids, right? It's the whole family. It's the grandparents, it's the parents, it's the youngest sister. They're all out there, right? Or if they can go, if they can't go, then they support it, right? And you also have a middle class that's extremely empowered by all this, right? Because they have to pay for schools, they have to pay for healthcare. You also have you're starting to see an upper middle class support for this, right? And that today, for example, the protests moved all the way uptown. Yeah, I mean, what they call rioting and everything in Santiago, for example, has been more in downtown because that's a big area where people normally go to celebrate soccer games, and we will win. We want to win a lot, or World Cups and all that kind of stuff. So you have more problems there, right? But those problems are mostly, and I would say almost 100%, provoked by our militarized police. So if you look at photos, you can see we don't have police like NYPD. We have militarized police.
Oh,
it's in between the military. Yes,
the NYPD could get quite
they're decked out.
militarized, but I know what you're talking about. I've seen the photos.
They're completely decked out, and
they don't look like they don't even look
use
like riot police. They look more like straight up like war zone military. It's yeah.
yeah, and now because we know how many tear gas canisters they buy, right, and they constantly buy more. Now we know they're using around 1,000, 2,000 at least tear gas in Santiago a day. And that's only Santiago. You have all the regions, you have the same problem. People protesting, like very peacefully, right? Because you go with your kid, so you're not going to start a freaking riot, right?
Right.
And immediately you got tear gas, you get abused, etc. If we want numbers, it's they just came out and at least 5,000 detained, 5,000 people, right? And of those, at least 10% are underage, right?
Right. So
15% at least one.
This is. I mean, this is a massive, like, you know, the generational, it crosses generations, but it seems like it's sort of like a youth-led movement.
Yes, yes, I would say so. Yeah, absolutely. And in addition, now they learned new tactics. Just a few years ago, they sent all the higher end officers to Israel to learn how to, I guess, repress better. And they came back, and now they're shooting their tear gas canisters directly in your face.
Right.
So you have an enormous amount. I mean, I'm not joking. It's only by tear gas they lost their eyesight, 35 people. Of those, at least 3 kids. I'm talking about kids that are under 12 years old. They lost eyes, right? They're using a special kind of bullets now, what you would call like, what was it, pellets, right? Made out of lead.
Jeez.
So they
Right.
don't explode inside of your body. They just perforate, and they're like this big. You can see the photos. You know, people that have been injured.
I have seen that people in protesters in Chile are, speaking of the Hong Kong protests earlier, you know, solidarity there between the protesters being that it seems like they've adopted some of the tactics. For example, the way to put out the tear gas canisters. I've seen video of, you know, the Chile protesters picking up the canisters, dropping it in the water bottle, like the people in the protesters in Hong Kong have been doing. So it's really interesting to watch just basically how the tactics are being shared and you know, just by watching them go on.
Yeah, I mean, we wish we had access to all this really fancy gear that they have in Hong Kong.
Right.
They're very stylish in Hong Kong, and Chile is very expensive. And I mean, a good gas mask against this tear gas. I mean, talk about tear gas. Only Santiago, the tear gassing every single day, right? So now I just came back and spent a week there, right? You walk around in Santiago, even far away from all the trouble, so to speak, right? And it's everywhere in the air, because this kind of tear gas is actually a powder, a very, very nice, but like almost white, right?
Right.
And that powder sticks around. It sticks to your body. It sticks to your clothing, to your hair, right? The tear gas they're using now, it's unbelievable because they shoot it, explodes, right? And you can't walk into it. It's like a wall. And you take you inhale, right? And you get it inside of your body. And it will be okay. I mean, think about tear gas like that is to disperse protests, right? Protesters. So you will be, you can walk away and then you're sneezing a little bit, you'll be fine. This is not the case. This sticks inside of your body for days, in your lungs. It gives you headaches. You might throw up for days, right? And an added bonus is that your speech gets slurry. You don't notice it, but your speech gets slurry for days afterwards. I mean, it's and if you continue doing this to the population, right? These are guys. This government has not. I mean, they have tear gas kids inside of the schools, inside of the metro system. Can you imagine a tear gas inside of the New York subway?
You'd have
Huh?
the station would evacuate. It'd be impossible to. There's nowhere for it to go. I mean, it's just.
Yeah, exactly.
You would
No,
need
and people get extremely scared and they start running, right?
Right.
And of course, I mean, the Santiago Metro is as populated as the subway system in New York. So you have millions of people that go through it every day, right?
Now let me ask you actually, because I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. I want to sort of, I guess, get a timeline here. So when did, what was the critical moment that sort of sparked these actions? Like there was a moment where the people took to the streets, or in this case, it seems like the subways.
The subways.
What sparked the actual? Obviously this has been building. Like you gave us a really great background of how this was been building, and it was obviously leading to this moment. But what was what happened when what made people at this point just say enough is enough? What sparked it?
Well, so you had the students. This is important. You saw the students, right? We will see the students, the public school kids, right, fighting to get a better public education, a free, better public education, maybe to get rid of the director of the school, right? And they would do the sit-ins, right? And the repression from the police would get worse and worse to a certain level where you would see them actually beat them up as they would walk into the school. They would throw tear gas inside of the school. They came up with a law which is called the Control Your Identity Law, right? Which meant that they can actually check for your ID if you're under 16 years old. And stuff like that. It's just control, and basically standing outside of the schools and beating the kids up, right? Which of course provoked a reaction, right?
Right.
The kids would not take that, right? And the parents got involved, and they got beaten up, right? And the government basically thought it was okay because they were protesting. They were not going to school. They're not doing the right thing that they should be doing, obedient, right? So this was going on, right?
Right.
When the government thought it would be a great idea to hike up the fare. Now, the metro system in Santiago serves millions of people, right? And it's a way for people that live far away from their workplace to commute, right? This means that just a small fare hike meant that their families, they're already poor, right? We get less money, right? We spend more money on trips and that kind of stuff. So the kids, you have to add all these things. They start jumping the turnstiles. And by doing that, the government thought it would be a good idea to go into the metro system, inside of the metro, and start beating up the kids, throwing tear gas and all that kind of stuff. And immediately after that, to declare a state of emergency. That in Chile we use that a state of emergency when we have plenty of earthquakes,
Right. Yeah.
all that kind of stuff, right? So they used that, and then they installed immediately a curfew. A curfew that would start at 8 o'clock. It would end at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's insane. It's insane. This is medieval, right? So what sparked it was the fact that the kids are jumping the turnstiles. The cops go in there, this militarized police that we have, right? They go in there, start beating, grabbing everything they could get hand on. And imagine you have thousands of people inside of the system, and they might not have anything to do with this or might support this, but doesn't really matter. The repression was brutal, right? And And this always it shuts down the whole metro system. So hundreds of people, they've been outside, just going to the metro to take the metro. Suddenly you have hundreds of people that start talking, obviously, and they get pissed, right?
Right.
So I think it was just too much. When you just have, it's like in being an abusive relationship, right? You had too much. If you get to have from your community, you can get out of it, right?
Right. Now,
I don't know, something like that.
No, but you mentioned the state of emergency, and this is this when President Pina basically he said when declaring the state of emergency that we are at war. I mean, is this what you're talking about?
We are at war.
Right.
I guess very organized groups, and everybody was, who are you talking about? Now, why did he say that? Now we understand why he's saying that. Because the state of emergency is in the law that was written during the dictatorship, right? In the law, it says they has to come up with a certain argument for it. You have to justify it, right?
Right. So he declared war on his own people, pretty much, because that's what they. I mean,
basically, all these groups, they were burning down the metro, and now this is interesting. So Santiago, like New York, many other cities in the world, they have this whole system, with cameras everywhere, right? Very fancy. So you had actually at least 8 stations that were burned down within the lapse of 1 hour, right? And we can't find the footage of it anywhere. It's gone, right? So supposedly the origin for the state of emergency and the curfew and this amazing control over the country, right, has its origin in the people, some groups, right, well-organized groups, went around burning down stations. And stations are made actually out of stainless steel. They're actually made not to burn because of the risks, to have so many people inside in tunnels, right?
Right.
And they burned. Yeah. So they find one person apparently, but that's it. But one person that can't burn 8 stations, right?
Right.
But that's the audience.
Maybe the Flash.
Yeah, and it's this whole other thing that's very interesting is that, speaking of the United States, so this apparent organ. Oh well, you know what? In between the burning of the stations, right, and when he declared a state of emergency, Piñera went to have some pizza, very expensive pizza. Pizza cost $26.
A slice?
He thought he had the time to just go uptown to have his pizza, and he and since everybody has a phone to take photos and to take videos, and it was all over the social media, all that kind of things. So what?
I'm assuming
about the U.S.
I'm assuming that Piñera. I want to stay on him for a little bit. I'm assuming his sort of.
He's on the Forbes list, by the way. You know that, right?
I did not. Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
well,
his family is extremely wealthy.
Yeah, you mentioned his brother earlier, so I'm assuming they, I'm assuming they got a nice little.
No, they don't come from money. No, he just did really good.
They got a nice racket going on somehow.
Oh yeah, no. He basically he stole his boss's idea for the monopoly of the this the little machine where you use your credit card when you pay at the store.
The ATM.
So no, like when you pay at the store, not ATM.
Oh, like the credit card processing machine. Right.
Yeah, that one exactly. He has basically the monopoly for that in Chile. That's how he started his business.
Oh, so pretty much everyone who uses a credit card pays him a fee.
Yeah.
I don't like that. So.
And he was actually in the 70s. He a little bit later, I think. He was in charge of a bank, and he basically stole everything from the bank. And but it was a good thing to have a minister as a brother, right?
Right.
During the dictatorship.
Now, how does he portray himself politically, though? Like, he's like, is he some sort of like center? From what I was reading, I could be wrong though. He sort of is in like a center, like democratic type party, like a centrist type, like not he's not a right winger, like in terms of how he's portrayed, right?
Well, he tries to portray himself a little bit of a centrist Christian Democrat, right wing in the economics. The state should be a little bit smaller. Very, he's very into this whole entrepreneurial thing. Everybody can be an entrepreneur and just work yourself out of it.
So he really is
streetwise.
the perfect figure when you hear the word neoliberal. That's like you could put him in a dictionary next to the word neoliberal.
Yeah. He actually he got a PhD in economics at Harvard. When his older brother, this same guy I was talking about, Jose Piñera, was one of the was a assistant professor or something like that. So I always thought, and I read his dissertation, and it's about the economics of education.
Ah.
And I'm 100% sure he didn't write it. I'm pretty sure he didn't write it. There's an Argentine economist that wrote it, I think. But anyways, that's what he did. And then he stole money from the bank, and so yeah, center. So the thing is that in Chile, the center is so far right.
Well, that's how it is here too, right? It is sort of amazing to me because
compared to Europe, for example.
I think yes, and I think some people think of South America, or did at maybe just a few years ago even, and thought like you look at Ecuador, you look at Bolivia, and a lot of these countries they're sort of like more left wing. And I feel like maybe people thought that was something, but of course there's countries like Colombia that, thanks to the United States, we're not in that group. And I guess, Chile is part of that too. But I think people have woken up to this notion that South America is some sort of leftist paradise, especially after Bolsonaro and what's going on in Brazil, especially, I feel like. But, do you think, looking at Bolsonaro in Brazil, do you think sort of like, and Trump here in the United States, do you think what's going on in Chile now and how Piñera has responded to it, do you think that his whole facade of being some sort of like centrist, neoliberal type, that's, the good centrist, I guess, do you think that facade is sort of dead now, just like how, the idea that there's a such thing as a compassionate conservative died with the Trumps and the Bolsonaros?
Oh yeah, because he showed his fastest streak very, very fast.
Right.
And this is interesting because he tried very, very. This is the second time Chile elects him. The second time. I mean, it's insane. It's like It's like when Bush Jr., like we elected twice. He lied, and everybody just went and voted for him again. It was like, oh my God. But wow.
Quick question
you had
though.
A little problem there in Florida. But
did Piñera actually win the first time? Because Bush didn't.
I know. Exactly. I was thinking about that. I was like, wait a second. He actually did.
Okay.
But yeah, he immediately, from being this a little bit Christian Democrat light, very pro business and investment, and he's a pathological liar. He lies. I mean, he gave the only interview he gave now on Sunday. He doesn't give interviews to the press or anything like that. Was to BBC for some random reason. Where he basically says all kinds of things like when asked about if what he thinks about the protests and everything, and he was like, "But I have protested too." And people is like, "Well, you're protesting against yourself, you idiot. You don't